As if playing Dark Souls 2 wasn't bad enough, let me introduce you to Double Dark Souls 2. We've got twice the gank squads, twice the chance to die from gravity, and twice the BS that is Shrine of Amana. In this video, we're going to go through all the quirks and features of playing two Dark Souls games with one controller. I'm also going to go over all the strategies I learned while playing the game this way, and how I dealt with each boss in this unique challenge run, in case you're struggling yourself or you want to try this challenge too. So have fun and enjoy! In order to set up this challenge, I ran the Scholar of the First Sin edition of Dark Souls 2 on my PS5, and I emulated the original version via RPCS3 emulator on my PC. With a PS4 controller, you can set it up to communicate via Bluetooth to your console, and plug it into your PC with a micro USB cable. Once you've done that, both systems will take inputs from the exact same controller. That's really all there is to it. So the rules for this challenge were also quite simple. I could play through in whatever way that I saw fit, and for each boss required to beat the game, I had to defeat the boss on the same attempt on both sides. So if I was fighting a boss and died on one side, I would have to die on the other side. So I did do quite a bit of planning to start the run off. I knew I would want to use the rapier and I would want to get it to +10 as fast as possible. So there's two reasons for this. One, the rapier is very great damage over time. It pokes relatively quickly and it does high damage. And the other reason is that it allows you to block and poke at the same time, which would prove invaluable during a lot of sections in the run. So we started this run as the Sorcerer class with a Bonfire Ascetic as a starting gift. I knew I needed the Bonfire Ascetic to pick up extra upgrade materials in the Forest of Fallen Giants, and we wanted to start as Sorcerer just so I could have access to ranged magic at the start, which would help during a lot of sections. But overall my build would be kind of a jack of all trades. I knew by the time I got to the Skeleton Lords I needed to have Yearn, and I wanted to be able to cast Heavenly Thunder, but aside from that we were going to rely completely on the damage of our upgraded rapier. So immediately when I started playing the game, I noticed that my characters would just naturally get desynced due to differences in the analog values on the sticks between each game. So you're going to see that I use a lot of rubbing against walls and other tricks to reposition my characters to be perfectly aligned. This is most brutal when we come across sections that are just open bridges with falls to our death on either side. But when traveling down hallways, the camera will naturally realign. And if we're opening chests, doors, or climbing ladders, we can also line up our characters and line up our cameras just by pressing the R3 button. So I use that quite a bit. So first things first, we were going to head to the last giant, the first boss of the game. When going through the Forest of Fallen Giants, you can see that after taking out all the enemies in the forest, our camera positioning and our character positioning is hugely out of whack between the two games. But I get on a ladder here, and when you're on a ladder, you only move up and down by pressing up and down on the stick. So by moving my camera around and using left and right adjustments, I can keep one side centered on the ladder while I maneuver the other side to get to the same ladder. Once both characters are on the same ladder, as long as there are no enemies on screen, R3 will center your camera, and at that point I'm perfectly back in sync. So we use this a ton. Of course, this does not work if there are enemies on screen because you'll just lock on whatever side can see enemies, so it doesn't work all the time. Forest of Fallen Giants was kind of uneventful as a whole, aside from getting completely ganked when I aggroed all the enemies. We were super dead on this attempt, but once we had opened up the fog wall in this area, we could just run through and not have to deal with a lot of the enemies in the area. The only other trick I used during this level was the cheeky little firebomb shortcut where you blow up some barrels on the other side of the wall. And with that, we proceeded to the last giant. Probably the easiest strat for killing the last giant in this way is by running past him and using the length of the arena to your advantage. So right out of the gate, we run through his legs, turn around, lock on, fire a soul arrow or two, and as he approaches, you just rinse and repeat. Run past him, turn around, shoot, run past him, turn around, shoot. For the entirety of the fight, this becomes more and more difficult. Depending on the boss's AI, he can use different attacks or approach you at different speeds, so you might end up in a situation where you're running forward and one boss is on one end of the arena and the other boss is on the other end of the arena. So eventually this strategy does kind of unravel and you may have to improvise. Luckily, his attacks are pretty slow and sweeping, so it's pretty easy to get into a position where you're going to naturally dodge an attack based on your positioning on one side, and then if you have to roll on the other side, you can more easily do that compared to other bosses. Now casually, the last giant is considered a very easy boss, but when you're playing the game in this way, he's just the right amount of difficulty. Now for the Pursuer fight, I was not above using the Ballista. I tried many times to get the double Ballista kill, and I think this was a consequence of me playing the original Dark Souls 2 on an unpatched version 1.00. When I use the Ballista on him, he doesn't stagger as long as he does in the Scholar version. So while I got the Ballista kill on the Scholar side, I had to fight him normally after that on the original side, which isn't too bad. You do have to deal with any enemies that you ran past before the boss fight coming into the boss arena after the boss is dead. But in my case, I had actually despawned all of the enemies on the run up to the Pursuer because the run up is brutal. And once you're in New Game Plus, you have an extra red phantom to deal with on the run up as well. So it ends up being so many attempts that I ended up despawning all of the enemies. So after killing the last giant and the Pursuer, it was time to activate a bonfire ascetic and do it all over again. So this was not only for extra souls, but for an extra 3 Titanite chunks that spawn in a chest underneath the Ballista room. So this is available once you're in New Game Plus. Some of the chest contents will change. And in order to get my rapier leveled up faster, I used this bonfire ascetic to access these extra upgrade materials. Also, after you kill the Pursuer for the first time, you then have access to the Dragonrider shield by dropping through the hole just after the boss fight. And this shield was absolutely vital for the entirety of the run. It's one of the best medium shields in the game, and it offers 100% physical block with pretty good shield stability. High shield stability means that when you're blocking attacks, less stamina is consumed, so you're less likely to get shield broken. So it's an absolutely great shield for blocking and poking, and when you block physical attacks, you take no damage. So we relied on the Dragonrider shield very heavily throughout most of the run. Now for the Dragonrider, I was always going to just do the 7-step method. Funnily enough, we entered the boss fog at slightly different times, which led to a little bit of a desync, but the strategy still worked out, luckily enough. So at this point, all of the easy bosses in the run had been taken care of, and the game was going to get very serious very quickly. So the next plan was to get the cat ring and drop down into the gutter where I could collect my first fragrant branch of yore, and I would use that fragrant branch of yore to get access to the Shaded Woods and the Najka boss fight. Now there is a strategy where you can get her stuck on a tree, and this would have completely trivialized the fight, but by the time I realized that this was an option, I had already done a few attempts on this boss, and once she destroys the large trees in the arena, they actually never come back until you go up in a new game cycle. So that option was not available to us. However, we did have a +8 rapier at this point, and it was just a matter of using the Dragonrider shield to block whenever possible, avoid the tail grab attack because that is unblockable. Running to dodge magic is helpful, but it can also be blocked. When you block the magic, it's actually not that much damage. Also, on her big magic attacks, the first hit will knock you down, which means all of the future soul spears will miss, which means getting hit by the magic usually isn't a kill as long as you stay at full health. The best thing that you can do in this fight is try to circle around to the side and bait a tail attack, and you can stand beside her and the tail attack will whiff and just attack until your stamina runs out. And so this was a common theme for a lot of bosses in the run, is that when you have an opportunity to attack, just try to empty your stamina bar because you need to get as much damage in as you can. Being more aggressive is going to lead to better odds beating the boss, because if I just sit behind my shield at all times, the boss can kind of just whittle me down. I have to kill the boss, obviously. So the next fight was the Prowling Magus and Congregation fight. This one was actually pretty tough. This is another boss that's treated kind of as a joke if you're just playing the game normally. It's really just a boss fight that consists of a bunch of normal enemies in a small room. And the secret to success here was just to rush and try and kill the 2 miracle casters as fast as possible, because they're the most lethal enemies in the room. So as soon as I walk through the boss fog, it's actually lucky that your lock-on will typically go to the right side miracle caster as soon as you enter. So it's easy enough to just run in and kill that guy. And even if you take some hits, you're probably not going to die, but getting one of those guys down is going to make the fight a lot easier. So you just try to rush that guy as fast as you can. Then we tried to kill the second guy in short order after healing up. And after you've taken out those 2 guys, the fight does become pretty much trivial, even when you're playing side by side in this way. After killing the Prowling Magus and Congregation, we were able to take our rapier to +10 by collecting all the upgrade materials around Brightstone Cave Seldora. So in this area there are a whole bunch of lizards that have Titanite chunks, and there's also a pickup in the Spike Trap Pit, which gets you everything you need to take your rapier up to +10, which is the maximum level for any weapons with a regular upgrade path. Next we took a quick trip to No Man's Wharf to pick up the Urine Sorcery from Carillion of the Fold. This spell is the same as an Alluring Skull, where it will distract enemies, but an Alluring Skull only lasts 2 seconds, while Urine lasts 10 seconds. Since we were already in the area, I decided to fight Flexile Sentry to test out how powerful our new +10 rapier was, and oh boy, it is powerful. Here we made good use of block and poke, and because our damage was so high, we didn't really need to think too hard about this fight, and we got this one first try. So next up is the Ruined Sentinels, and I have one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, is that we had actually tried to do this run once before with less of a plan in mind. So I had put 16 hours into a playthrough prior to this one that we completed, and when I got to the Ruined Sentinels, I was just using a +4 mace, and I think I had a +4 rapier as well, but I was splitting my upgrade materials between the 2 weapons, which proved to be a bad idea. And we simply didn't have the amount of damage necessary to give ourselves a shot at beating this boss at all. These guys are a pretty serious step up in difficulty from everything that we've fought so far, but I put a lot of hours into this one, and it was one of the big walls that I was excited to get over. So the strategy for the Ruined Sentinels involves staying on the starting platform as much as you possibly can. And when you're on that first platform, as long as the first Sentinel is still alive, the next Sentinels will not come up to fight you. Once you've killed the first guy, the second guy will jump up, and then the third one will jump up about 10 seconds after that. So ideally, the way this fight would go is after killing the first one, and you have as much time as you possibly could need for that, you want to try and rush the second guy before the third guy shows up. But once the third guy shows up, you're pretty much going to have to abort the staying on the platform plan in favor of having more space to run around and dodge their attacks. Once you've dropped down to the main area, it's mostly just a matter of finding your openings. You're going to have to be blocking a lot, and you're going to have to be very careful, because when you're fighting a 2v1 situation, you're in pretty serious danger of getting guard broken. And so I had to actually not only find times to get damage and to get healing in, but also find times to let my guard down so that I could recover stamina at a faster rate. So this is the hardest part of the fight for sure, is when you're dealing with a 2v1 on each side and trying to find your openings. It really comes down to luck on what the bosses decide to do, because ultimately if you're going in for an attack, you need all 4 bosses, 2 on each side, to sort of get their attacks lined up at the same time so that you have an opening on both games. So it took a serious amount of patience, and it took a lot of life gems, but we did eventually get through it. So after Ruined Sentinels is the Lost Sinner, and this was a surprisingly easy fight. Now I had initially planned to light up the boss arena by using the Bastille key to open up the side rooms, and then you use your torch to light some oil. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I knew that with the room lit up, you have much better lock-on range. However, in order to light up the room on the original side, the Bastille key is locked behind the gargoyles fight. I decided to try the fight without lighting up the arena, and I was surprised that actually we didn't lose lock-on that often. It was really only times where the Lost Sinner jumped and we were too close that we would lose lock-on. But by this point in the run, I was actually pretty good at fixing lock-on desyncs. When you lose lock-on with the boss on one side only, you actually have to turn your camera and then look away from the boss, then click the stick to get rid of lock-on on the side that is locked on, and then you have to turn your camera back so that both sides are looking at the boss so that you can re-lock on. So it's a little bit of a process when you do lose lock-on in these types of fights, but this fight is actually just an easier version of the Ruined Sentinels. You're going to be blocking, you're going to be trying to outmaneuver the boss. Avoiding moves is going to grant you more opportunities to attack rather than blocking moves. But you can still use block and poke strategies. In a one-on-one boss scenario, getting guard broken usually doesn't lead to a punish unless the boss has like a serious combo attack that breaks your guard on a hit that isn't the last hit. The thing with Dark Souls 2 guard breaks is that you actually don't get damaged when your guard gets broken. You will only get damaged from subsequent attacks. And most bosses will not follow up after they've broken your guard unless it's a very specific, 3 or 4 hit combo that they do. The Lost Sinner fight was very similar to the Ruined Sentinel fight, just with less bosses per boss fight. So this one actually took, I think, a single-digit number of tries, and we were able to claim our first Lord Soul without too much resistance. So the Skeleton Lord fight is pretty straightforward. You're going to have to rush the left side one, and while he's spawning his minions after you've killed him, you're going to need to cast Yearn or use an Alluring Skull. Yearn lasts 10 seconds, while Alluring Skulls only last 2, so I would much rather have Yearn in this fight than Alluring Skulls. But while the first Yearn is active, you want to kill the right side skeleton, and you want to save the middle one, which is the one that spawns Bone Wheels, for last. On the Scholar Edition, it only spawns 2 Bone Wheels, but on the original it spawns 4, so you pretty much need to have Yearn up at all times, or you need to kill the skeletons as they spawn. And so my strategy here involved using Yearn to group up all the skeletons, and then casting Heavenly Thunder to try and deal with them en masse. So I did have to use my rapier to kind of clean up the stragglers, because Heavenly Thunder is dependent on RNG. But once we got it down to just the Bone Wheel skeletons, it wasn't too bad. However, it was very scary, because having to deal with 4 of them is pretty brutal. After a fairly quick stroll through Harvest Valley, we came across the Covetous Demon. Now this guy actually almost took us more than one try. He's known as one of the easiest bosses in the game, but when you fight him side by side in the simultaneous playthrough, he's actually a pretty decent challenge. You've got to move around, you got to block. Not everything is blockable, and you got to pick your shots at the right time. Luckily, we had been leveling our Vigor stat quite a bit, so we had just enough health to survive some attacks that nearly killed us. But we did get this guy first try with no practice, so he wasn't really that bad. So next up was Mytha, the Baneful Queen. And it's vital during this fight, just like any casual playthrough, where you have to burn the windmill in order to drain the poison from the boss arena. So this was our first use of Dark Weapon to increase our damage even further, and it really shows because we get some pretty serious damage here. I think it only takes about 3 or 4 full empties of your stamina bar to kill her. Most of her attacks are more easily dodged by strafing to the right than to the left. So for the majority of the fight, we're holding block, holding right on the stick. You're going to want to try and kite her so that she's not in the poison, which will cause her to heal. And if you stick close to her body, you're going to deal with less of her magic and projectile attacks, which is going to allow you more opportunities to hit her back yourself. The main thing is just to be aware that she does have a grab attack, and you're not going to be able to block that. So either spacing yourself out of range or trying to roll at the right time, depending on what both sides are doing, is going to be the best way to deal with her. So with Mytha defeated, we were finally in Lava World, also known as the Iron Keep. This area was the longest area by far that we had to trek through in the run. And it's kind of one of those notorious levels for having way too many enemies. Pretty much all the enemy placements here are different compared to the two versions. But we ended up creeping through using block and poke a lot to just slowly take down each enemy one by one. We were also able to finally collect the Dull Ember, which allows for weapon infusions. We had picked up the Dull Ember about 15 hours earlier in the run on the Scholar side because that one is located in the Lost Bastille, but in original Dark Souls 2, you're not able to infuse your weapons until you've picked up this Ember in the Iron Keep. So we ended up skipping the Smelter Demon, although we did put one attempt in, to not much success. And the way that we got through this area was that we ended up despawning pretty much all the enemies up to the Smelter Demon, and then I ended up leapfrogging, as in taking each side one by one just to get to the bonfire before the Old Iron King. But the Old Iron King also took around 90 attempts. At first we were trying to kill him with spells, but we're doing way less damage with our soul arrows compared to our rapier. So we could have definitely done this in far fewer attempts had we just stuck with our better weapon from the get-go, but I put a lot of attempts in trying to use ranged magic, trying to use the strategy where you hide around the corner and avoid all of his attacks except for the laser. However, the real problem here is all the holes in the arena. So what I ended up coming up with for a strategy here was that the less movement, the better. I tried to just not move. There's only a handful of moves that the Old Iron King can hit you with if your back is directly against the fog wall. All of his melee attacks, except for the Lava Plume Explosion Double Fist attack, can hit you, and then you just have to watch out for Flames and Fire Laser. When you're stabbing him in the face while he's breathing fire, it's actually a pretty narrow range that you can be in where you can get damage in without being hurt yourself. Through the 89 plus attempts that I did with this fight, I got pretty good at finding that positioning. But you can see when he's doing his melee attacks and we're directly right next to the fog wall, we get free time to heal. We get to check and see if he's going to do a follow-up or not, and then we get a lot of opportunities for attacks when he does slam his fists down. I was extremely lucky here that I got hit by the fire, and while my original side character was knocked down, I could position my Scholar side to get towards the exit door. And so this was some on-the-fly thinking by me where I figured I could probably prevent my Scholar side from dying if I could get him into that room, and then I could freely move around a lot more on the original side while I finished off the boss. So this was another strategy that I used in some of the bosses towards the end of the run. Occasionally you'll kill the boss a lot sooner on one side than the other, and in that case you are going to end up having an easier time because then you're just focusing on one boss. And so once we figured out this specific strategy, the Old Iron King went down without too much difficulty. It was just we wasted a lot of attempts trying to kill him with magic and trying to hide around corners and stuff, so he wasn't that bad. And then immediately after killing the Old Iron King, we went down to try the Rotten again. I figured that this fight could be quite easy as long as we can get an arm chop. And I had seen a lot of different strategies for cutting off the Rotten's arm, but once you get the arm cut off, the fight does get pretty much trivial. We still have to be careful with the fire in this area, but we were really waiting for that overhead slam attack because that allows us to chop the arm in 3 hits, and we can get that all in one go. So really all it takes here is to get an arm chop on just one side, and once one side has its arm chopped off, you really don't even need to look at that screen anymore. Both sides are locked on, so you can kind of just hold forward, and we have enough vigor at this point too that we don't get one-shotted by anything anymore. So even if we take hits, it's no big deal. Of course, if he hits you with his stump or whatever from having the arm chopped off, it's almost no damage, but we're able to just roll on the side that still has an arm, and we can take all our hits as much as we want on the other side. You can see when I'm killing him on the left, I didn't realize that I was walking into a fire pool on the right, but this attempt does still count. We still did kill him on the same try on both sides, so obviously if I can prevent deaths like that, I'm going to try to, but by the time I realized I was in the fire there, it was too late. But yeah, once we figured out how to chop off the arm in pretty short order, the Rotten became quite easy. So at this point in the run, we'd killed 3 out of the 4 Lord Souls to open up the Shrine of Winter to progress to the second half of the game. So if you're not familiar with Dark Souls 2, you have to kill 4 specific bosses to open up the Shrine of Winter to get to the second half of the game. And at this point, we had killed 3 out of the 4. We had killed the Rotten, the Old Iron King, and the Lost Sinner, and we still had Dukesteer Freya, the double-headed spider. However, at this point, I noticed that we were pretty much at 1,000,000 soul memory, and that's the other way to progress. You can kill the 4 old ones, or you can have 1,000,000 soul memory. While I had put a couple of attempts into killing Freya, I knew this would probably be the hardest of the 4 boss souls, and so I opted to just move on with my 1,000,000 soul memory rather than trying for many hours on a boss that I'm not even sure how I would possibly kill. So the first boss in the castle is the double Dragonrider fight. So you can see when we run in, the strategy here is that you want to lock on, which will lock on to the grounded Dragonrider. Then you can immediately toggle your lock on up to the one with the bow up on the platform. And once you've hit him with something, it doesn't matter what, it doesn't matter how much damage you hit him for, but if you hit him once, he'll come down and join the fight. So if you want to turn this, instead of being a 2v1 on both sides, to being a 1v1 on both sides, you want to kill that archer as fast as possible. And it just so happens that the archer dies in far fewer hits than the regular Dragonrider. So the Dragonrider archer will die in pretty much 1 empty of your stamina bar. So we can go down and just poke him to death really quickly before the other Dragonrider catches up. And at that point, it's a fair fight on each side. We're just dealing with 1 Dragonrider on each side. Although this is technically a repeated boss, the fact that you pretty much always cheese the first Dragonrider that you encounter in this playthrough kind of makes this fight sort of fresh. We end up just sidestepping a lot, holding up our shield. While he can break our shield with his own shield bash attack, the move that's kind of designed for breaking shields, there isn't really any follow-up after he does that move. So the only time you really have to worry about a shield break costing you some amount of your HP is when he does a 2-hit combo and you block the first hit without a full amount of stamina. So you can see that happens a couple of times on the right, where he does a 2-hit combo, and we had very little stamina from attacking or blocking previously, and then he breaks our guard and then does his follow-up swing. That 2-hit attack is really the only time that we take damage. Otherwise, it's really just a lot of strafing and picking our shots when we have an opening on both sides, and this fight didn't take too many tries. I think it was like 2 or 3. And we were on to the second half of the castle. So at the end of the castle, we have to fight the Looking Glass Knight. Now this guy took a lot of tries as well. He's very tanky. The thing about this fight is that he always opens with the attack where he jumps at you. And so by running forward, that attack will always go over your head, and you can turn around and hopefully get some damage if you're fast enough. Every fight started out the exact same way. We would run forward, we would turn around, and we would lock on, and we would stay locked on for the majority of the fight. So he has some nasty combos that he'll rarely use, but there are some 3-hit sword swipes, and there are some 4-hit sword swipes. So you can see we're using a lot of strafing. You've really got to get around that giant shield of his to get some damage in, because poking him where his shield is won't do anything. So a lot of the fight is just waiting for openings, but still trying to get a lot of damage in when we can. We want to take full advantage of our dark weapon buff. And one thing that I discovered in all my attempts of the Looking Glass Knight fight is that when he summons help, he'll put down his shield and an NPC will bust out of it. Now we were playing offline, so there was no chance of getting invaded here. But the thing is that this action where he summons a helper in his fight, it's actually just on a timer. So it happens at very regular intervals, and the only thing that can delay his summoning process is if he's in the middle of an attack animation. So for the most part, both Looking Glass Knights will do their summoning at the same time, unless you get unlucky with the attacks that he's choosing to do. There are fights that I had where he would be in the middle of like a long lightning animation, and in that case he might delay his summoning by up to 6 or 7 seconds. But the fight is on a timer, and so it's something like every 4 minutes he'll do his summoning process. And if you haven't killed the enemy that he summons, he'll just keep summoning them. There's no limit on the amount of enemies that he can summon. But we found a good strategy to deal with the summoning, and that was to just try and kill whatever he summoned. There's 2 possible enemies he can summon, by the way. And one of them has a sword and shield, and the other one has a poking stick. But the strategy was, as soon as he summons his helper, we just go ham We make sure that we're buffed up, because we do have time to cast our buffs again while he's in his summoning animation. And while he's in that animation, he gets a huge defense buff for the duration of the summoning. So it's not even really worth it to attack him while he's trying to summon here. But you can take that time to rebuff your weapon, two-hand it, and then as soon as that enemy is about to spawn, you can lock onto him and just empty your stamina bar when he spawns, and you can kill him without too much risk of getting damage to yourself. So sometimes you do get attacked by the Looking Glass Knight before you've killed his summon, but we do have enough vigor at this point that that's not a huge issue as long as we're at full health. So you can see we kill him in one full empty of our stamina bar there, and we're even able to dodge the follow-up attack. Now at this point in the stream I was getting a little bit cheeky, and I was also worried about the horse knights that are in the hallway leading up to this boss fight. So when you kill a boss and you've got enemies waiting for you at the fog wall at the entrance, it's very likely that they're going to come into the arena and attack you once the boss is dead. So in order to avoid that, I tried to move my scholar side character out of the way. And I just kept moving and holding the block button on the original side. And for the content, I decided, hey, let's open up this chest in the middle of the boss fight. And I was lucky that we did, because it was pretty hilarious. We were able to collect our Spell Quartz Ring +2 and a Bonfire Ascetic and Soul Bolt while fighting the Mirror Glass Knight, or the Looking Glass Knight, on one side. So that was pretty hilarious. But at this point, I was extremely cautious because we had failed this fight 3 or 4 times prior, where we had killed the Looking Glass Knight on one side and then died to him on the other side. So there was a lot of restoring save backups in this fight. I think it took us something like 30 or 40 attempts on this boss. And about half of that, I wasn't really sure how to cleanly deal with the summons. And so it was a big help once we figured out that we could just kill the summon as soon as he spawned. That gave us a huge advantage. So if I were to do this boss fight again, I think I would have a much easier time given all of the tactics that I've learned here. So you can see I get some damage here. I probably should have been buffing Dark Weapon instead. But we were also able to kill this summon with an unbuffed weapon. It just took an extra attack. And you can see without that buff, we didn't kill him in one go. So we could have easily died here for sure. This was very sketchy, but we ended up successfully doing the fight, while the Scholar side was heading down to Shrine of Amana, which was pretty funny too. But yeah, Looking Glass Knight, very difficult. But not so difficult that it felt unfair. It was just a really good challenge. So we had a very, very long struggle going through Shrine of Amana, and the best part was that on the original side, we were using an unpatched version of the game. And if you know anything about original Dark Souls 2, when the game first came out, Shrine of Amana was much harder than it was 6 months after release, because the devs actually nerfed the spellcasters in this area. So they're casting Homing Soul Arrow on you repeatedly, and somewhere in the game's lifespan early on, they patched it so that the turning radius of the Homing Soul Arrows got nerfed pretty substantially. As long as you're walking perpendicular to the path of the spell, you'll be able to dodge it on the Scholar side, whereas on the original side, they track you so precisely that you pretty much always have to roll. Even if you're sprinting sometimes, the spell will track you so hard that you won't dodge it. So we had a very hard time once we got to the second stint after the first bonfire in the Shrine of Amana. We ended up going extremely slowly, killing all the enemies along the way, and this took a lot of attempts. Luckily, it didn't take so many attempts that any of the enemies in that section despawned, but that last section before that fog wall is absolutely brutal, especially on the original side, where you have extra spellcasters. This was a very brutal area. It was made even more brutal by the fact that we're playing 2 copies of the game at the same time. It took forever, I got super tilted and frustrated, but we did eventually get through it after about 3 hours of attempts. And it really is just that one area leading up to the fog gate that is the absolute worst. Once we were past that area, we could sprint from the next bonfire to the Demon of Song with no trouble. We're going to go into every boss fight with Dark Weapon buff active. And this boss wasn't too bad. It only took a few tries. There's a lot of time that you get where you can attack him when he's in the middle of pulling his hood over his face and pulling and coming out from where the hood is. So a lot of his hand attacks they have pretty lengthy ending animations. So like most fights in this game, it's a lot of positioning. Some of the overhead slams are not blockable, but they are pretty easily dodged just by backstepping and rolling far enough. So we had a tricky time with the synchronization of this boss, but at this point I was kind of over trying to kill bosses at the same time. I was totally fine with one boss dying sooner than the other and then us just doing cleanup on the other side. So while he does have a lot of big sweeping attacks, if you learn the positioning to get out of the way, after the attack is over, you have quite a bit of time to get a lot of damage in before he pulls his hood over his face. And for those unaware, when he's hiding away inside of his little hood flap, he can't be damaged, so you have to wait until he comes out again. So this fight was a lot of just positioning and getting as much damage in as you could when you had the opportunity. And you absolutely need to avoid that grab attack. On the left side, you see he did a big sort of swipe from both directions. If he grabs you, he will slam you on the ground multiple times, and this does a large amount of damage. I think we could survive it if we were at full health, but anything less than that and it would probably kill us. But you can see our +10 rapier made pretty short work of him. And then I just had to clean up on the original side, which didn't take too much. So overall, this boss only took a few tries. And it was really just getting used to what his attack patterns were, because I didn't do any practicing except for the fighting that I did on stream. So we took a couple of fights to learn the patterns, and on the third or fourth try, we got it without too much problem. So after the Demon of Song comes the Undead Crypt, which is a pretty annoying area. It's got a lot of enemies, it's got a lot of gravestones to maneuver around, but ultimately it wasn't too bad. We were able to open up the shortcut to Velstadt. The worst part is the run up to Velstadt. Now, there's a giant hallway, and on the Scholar side, you can enter the boss fog even if you ran past all the enemies without too much of a struggle. But on the original Dark Souls 2 side, you have two enemies that will often just camp the fog wall. And so in order to get proper Velstadt attempts in, we had to go through one at a time and despawn or kill a lot of the enemies. So what I did was I ended up running in while keeping the Scholar side at the bonfire. I would run over on the original side, kill the two enemies camping the fog wall. Then I would sit and run against the wall on the original side while I maneuvered the Scholar side to the same positioning. Then I would go in and I could run both into the fog wall at the same time. But honestly, entering the boss fog on the original side is worse than the boss fight itself. Now, Velstadt does have some big attacks that do some serious shield damage, but overall, there's nothing that really is going to catch you off guard with the Velstadt fight. Even though Velstadt has a lot of attacks that can break your guard, he only has one 3-hit combo, and you can block all 3 hits. There's a lot of attacks that can be sidestepped or backstepped to avoid. The Velstadt fight did take quite a few tries, but it was really just a lot of maneuvering, holding block, getting your positioning right, and getting as much poking in as you possibly could. There weren't really any tricks to this fight. It was just being extremely patient, watching out for openings. We ended up using a lot of life gems as well. But yeah, this was an extremely long fight, and the openings were pretty few and far between until I got better at backstepping attacks rather than blocking them. If you can get your positioning very good so that you can dodge the attacks instead of blocking them, you are awarded with more opportunities to attack. Also, you may think that his kick into overhead slam combo is a scary combination, and it appears that way at first, but even though both hits will break your guard, you can actually block the kick, have your guard broken, and bring your block back up before the overhead slam. And even though you only have a small amount of stamina for the overhead slam, it will still allow you to block all of the damage, even though your guard gets broken. So I think that's something that's a big difference between Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3. But yeah, I tried to strafe and backstep any attacks that I could, and it was just a long fight. Yeah, I don't really have any tips for Velstadt other than just block and move and get your attacks when you can. So the next fight, after going through Aldia's Keep, was the Guardian Dragon. And the main thing for Guardian Dragon is just not to lock on. You are going to have to run around a decent amount to dodge the fire breath, and he does like to jump away and fly up and do his fire breath on you. But at this point in the run, we're doing kind of an absurd amount of damage. And at this point, we had also done a Dark Infusion on our Rapier. So we had a Dark Rapier plus 10 that was buffed with Dark Weapon, which kills the Guardian Dragon in like a single digit amount of hits. So the strat here was just, you're going to be running around the arena a lot, but luckily there are no holes where you can fall to your death. If there were, this fight would be much harder. But if you're just running, most of the time his Flame Breath attacks aren't going to hit you. So a lot of the time we're not even looking at the boss, we're just waiting for an opening where he's doing a long Flame Breath attack and we can run in, and once you do close the gap, you can get 4 or 5 hits in, and that's going to take like half of his health bar away. And you can see we get hit once with the Flame Breath, but we have enough HP that even though the fire hit us twice, we were able to heal back up and we were fine. So at this point in the run, I had quite a bit of vigor, and it was a huge benefit. That was kind of my dump stat. Anytime I didn't have a stat target to hit when I was leveling up, I would dump it into vigor. And you can see the Guardian Dragon is really a pushover. Once you close the distance and you get those hits in, he dies very quickly. The trick is just run around and don't lock on and wait for your opening. So next up is the Giant Lord fight. So for this fight, I opted to use Dark Fog and ranged hexes instead of going in with our Rapier. And the reasoning was just that it's much easier to dodge his attacks when you're up on this platform because you have better vision on what he's doing. All of his attacks when you're on this platform are very slow and sweeping. You pretty much just have one side-to-side attack and one overhead. Even though he's not synced up most of the time, it's very easy to roll and dodge the attacks. And after you've dodged on both sides, you'll have an opportunity to cast either Dark Fog or Dark Orb. And so it's a pretty easy fight when you do it in this way. You don't have to worry about any meteors hitting you. And after some number of casts, he goes down. There's really not much else to it. Now, funnily enough, when I did this fight, I hadn't made a save backup before this boss, and we ended up killing him on one side, and then trading killing blows on the other side. You can see I cast a Dark Orb just as he's readying an overhead swing, and I get killed at the same time that I hit him with the spell. And I don't know how it works on other bosses, but with the Giant Lord specifically, it doesn't count as a kill unless you get the Giant's Kinship, which we did not get. So if you trade death blows on the Giant Lord fight, you actually have to fight him again. So while this technically counts for killing the boss on the same attempt on both sides, I wanted to get a proper double kill. So what I ended up doing was I used a Bonfire Ascetic on the Scholar of the First Sin side, and I fought the Giant Lord again, except he was on New Game Plus on the Scholar side and New Game Regular on the original side. But we used the exact same tactic of just casting spells at range, and we killed him in one try after that. We had this fight completely figured out at that point. And so we got the proper double kill with Scholar side on New Game Plus and original side on regular difficulty. Now, in order to even up the soul count that I had achieved, because the Giant Lord does give you kind of a tremendous amount of souls when you kill him, I ended up going through and using a Bonfire Ascetic on the original side afterwards, just so that I would have the same amount of souls to spend so that I could level up the same on both sides. So the Giant Lord was quite easy when you tackle it this way, and we got a ton of levels at this point that we mostly dumped into Vigor, I believe. So after the Giant Lord, there's only 2 bosses left, the Throne Watcher and Defender and Nashandra. So with the Throne Watcher and Defender, it was a big deal casting Dark Fog as soon as the battle starts. So with 2 casts of Dark Fog, you'll end up poisoning both enemies, and that ends up doing quite a bit of damage right out of the gate. We also had our weapon infused with Dark and buffed with Dark Weapon, and the amount of damage this deals to these enemies is kind of insane. I didn't realize that they went down so quickly, but you can do block and pokes, and in 2 or 3 hits, you can actually get them down to half health. And once you get these bosses down to half health, they jump away to do a buff where they infuse their weapon with lightning. In the time it takes for them to buff their weapon, you can be on them and pretty much get the extra 2 or 3 hits you need to defeat them at that point. So I was very surprised at how much damage we were dealing at this point, and I thought that this boss would be much harder than it was, but we just do so much damage, and it was really not too big of a fight at all. I think it only took us 2 attempts, and 1 attempt we failed just because we fell off of the cliff in this arena, so I was surprised at how easy Throne Watcher and Defender ended up being, but we just had so much damage and so much HP at this point that they were kind of a pushover. Now you can see I killed them about a minute apart, but the Nashandra cutscene is so long that I was able to just keep fighting them on the original side while the Nashandra cutscene played on the Scholar side, and so we were able to go into the Nashandra fight at the same time. Now we didn't get Nashandra in 1 try, so we ended up going back to this fight after the fact. And there was a little bit of learning that I had to do in order to figure out Nashandra as well. In order to maximize our damage here, I changed my weapon infusion from Dark to Lightning, because Nashandra does take more damage from lightning weapons than she does dark weapons. But we were still using Dark Weapon as a buff, which I was told by my chat is the most damage you can possibly deal to her, is by using a lightning infused weapon with Dark Weapon as a buff. And while she is susceptible to Dark Fog, you actually just get more damage by running in right from the beginning and using all of your 2-handed pokes while she's spawning curse jars in the arena. So that was our strat. As soon as we enter the boss fog for the Nashandra fight, we run ahead and we get as much damage in while she's spawning her curse items. And then the rest of the fight ends up where you're going to be running back and trying to bait the laser attack. So if you can get her to do the laser attack, you get another opportunity to run up and just get a whole bunch of damage in. And I was also taught that when you're using an item from a distance and she's in the middle of an animation, you can actually bait her into using her laser attack. So by popping a life gem, even though we didn't need to, it caused her to do a laser attack so we could run in and get a lot of damage. So with this fight, you're really just battling the curse damage that's happening over time, and the times that we did die to this boss fight, it was mostly from falling off of the edge while I was circling around Nashandra. Nashandra doesn't actually deal that much damage herself, so I don't even think I did much blocking in this fight. It's just a matter of going in, getting a bunch of damage, and yeah, we killed her in not too many tries. So you can see the rapier is busted, the Drangleic shield is busted, movement is busted, Dark Fog is busted, Dark Weapon is busted, and everywhere else you can use Urine plus Heavenly Thunder. But if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. This was double Dark Souls 2, and I believe it was the world first. I don't think anyone else has ever played 2 copies of a Dark Souls game with 1 controller before, and I don't think that anyone has ever done this with any 3D game or any game with analog movement. Now, if this isn't the case, please let me know, because I'm very interested in what other runs people have done in this way. If you liked this content and you want to see more of this run, I'm going to link a playlist in the description with the 14 episodes that I uploaded to this channel prior, which include uncut versions of every boss fight, along with every level in between. If you want to see the entirety of this playthrough in completely uncut footage, I have all of that available on my Twitch collections page, which is a total of 67.5 hours worth of content, completely raw and uncut. My next project is going to be double Demon Souls. So we're going to be playing through the original Demon Souls for PS3 and the Demon Souls remake for PS5 in the exact same way that we played through Dark Souls 2. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel and follow my Twitch if you want to watch that. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and we will see you in the next video.
Great sovereign, take your throne. What lies ahead, only you can see.